Hi, welcome to the YouTube studio here at the Munich Security Conference. My name is Victoria Reichelt and today I'm joined by Jason Bordoff. He's the founding director of the Center on Global Energy Policy and also a professor at the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. Mr. Bordoff, great to have you here.
Thank you for having me. Great to talk with you.
The first thing I want to know is, and for that I want to go back in time a bit, because you've also been a senior member of the US Security Council and a former special assistant of the Obama administration, and that ended in 2017, so quite a while ago. How has the world changed since then?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question and for having me on. And I worked for the first term of President Obama. So I left government in 2013 to start this new Energy Institute at Columbia more than a decade ago. And I think the world in many ways has changed a great deal. In many ways not. Look, we've seen in the last, if someone had come, if we were talking 10 years ago at the Munich Security Conference, and someone said to you that 1 in every 5 cars sold globally was going to be electric, or that the cost of solar would come down more than 90%, or the cost of batteries about 90%, that twice as much would be spent globally on clean energy as would be spent on fossil fuels, I think everybody would have thought this would exceed our wildest expectations.
That sounds great.
And would be incredibly ambitious. And in the last 10 years, all of those things have happened. And oil use is going up, and gas use is going up, and coal use is going up, and greenhouse gas emissions are still going up each and every year. And I think it's just a staggeringly kind of daunting reminder about the scale and magnitude of the global energy system, how big the tanker is, how hard it is to turn that around, that we can grow clean energy at really unprecedented rates. And we have so much more work to do. Because if someone had said 10 years ago, sitting at the Munich Security Conference, emissions would be higher 10 years from now than they are today, not just cumulative emissions, which is what matters, but the annual rate at which we are adding to that stock of cumulative emissions is going to keep going up every year, you would have said that's failure. And right now, both of those things are true.
Oh, that's true. Quite ambivalent. Speaking of climate change, like the number everyone's talking about is, of course, the 1.5 degree target. That is the target to prevent us from the worst that could happen. And you said back then we needed a staggering increase in clean energy investments, which we see is kind of happening. We are on the rise for that. But still, you're also hosting a panel with the title Fossil Fuel Phase Out. And this term phase out, that was criticized quite a lot since COP28. Is phasing out really enough, considering the state that we're in?
Well, the takeaway from COP28, there was a debate about phase out or phase down. And if you look at the modeling from the International Energy Agency or anyone for what it looks like to get to net zero, stop adding to the cumulative stockpile of CO2, even a net zero world still has some amount of fossil fuels. It's not zero, but it's much less than today. Today, we're nowhere close to on track for that, as I said. And oil, gas, coal use are still going up. Emissions are still going up. And so we are very, very close to the amount of CO2 that is cumulative in the atmosphere that would get you to an average warming temperature like 1.5 degrees Celsius. It is still technically possible to achieve a goal like that, but incredibly difficult. If you think about the pandemic, COVID, at the peak of the pandemic, more than half the global economy was on economic lockdown, and that year emissions fell 5%. We need them to fall by more than that every single year from this year forward if we're going to even keep 1.5 degrees in possible. And so we just have so much more work to do. So as I said, last year, $1.7 trillion was spent globally on clean energy, $1 trillion on fossil fuels. So that's twice as much. But we need 1.7 by the end of this decade to be somewhere between 4 and 5 trillion. A lot of that, most of that is going to be private capital, not public. So we need a lot of government and multilateral investment banks to help de-risk some of the private capital. And a lot of that is going to be in the emerging and developing economies. That's where the biggest growth in energy use is coming from. That's where people use very little energy today, and they want more prosperous lives, as they should have. And that's just a huge challenge to put very little of the capital today that's going into clean energy is actually in the parts of the world, the emerging and developing economies, where the emissions are growing fastest.
I also have a thought on the emerging economies, but I'm going to come to that later. You said the pandemic happened and everyone was like, oh my God, huge crisis mode. The world shut down. After that, the war in Ukraine happened that is still ongoing. Now we have the situation in Israel, Gaza, the war that is going on. Do you feel like in the global attention that the climate crisis is like a bit of a, is not the first target anymore to tackle?
Well, it's just a different kind of problem, and it's one we do respond to crises, whether it's the pandemic or conflict. If you look at here in Germany, what Germany was able to do within months build new natural gas import plants because you lost Russian gas supply and you have to heat homes and you have to prevent people from dying in the winter and you have to keep the lights on. And so it was sort of a heroic effort to move as fast as possible, cut through the bureaucratic red tape to build energy infrastructure, some zero carbon, some natural gas. So we respond to crisis. And even though we see, 18 events in the US last year with more than $1 billion in damage from severe weather. I mean, every year is warmer than the last. It's a different kind of problem when there's not a single incident that sort of causes us to mobilize. I do think that's changing. I see it on a campus every day with young people who care passionately about this issue, much more than the generation before did.
So they see it more of a direct, they see it as more of a direct threat that is threatening their lives or their lives.
That's my perception. And I mean, you see that in polling too. If how important is climate change to you? It's certainly more important and on both sides of the aisle in the United States, it's higher for Democrats than Republicans, but for both, it's higher for young people than it is for older people. And I think that's kind of, I think when I talk to a lot of people in the energy industry or in the financial community, what unexpected tipping points might come in the future. Certainly there are going to be climate tipping points when the impacts of climate might proceed at dangerously nonlinear ways. I do think social mobilization moves in that direction as well. And I think that's something that people don't always prepare for as much. In the United States, in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, we had an industrial activity, factories, plants. We polluted the air with acid rain and smog. We polluted the waterways. You couldn't swim in the lakes or the rivers or drink the water. And it just got worse and worse until it kind of all came to a head in the late 1960s. In April of 1970 was the first Earth Day ever. And 1 in 10 Americans came out into the streets to protest. Urban and suburban, Republican and Democrat, and they just sort of said collectively to our leaders, we can't live like this anymore. You have to do something about this. This can't go on. And there's a famous American economist, Herbert Stein, who famously said Stein's rule was, if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. And I sort of feel like that I feel that way about climate change. The question is when that this collective social mobilization comes to a head. There's another quote that made me think of this in The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway. There's a character named Mike, and Mike is asked how he went bankrupt. Mm-hmm. And his answer is 2 ways, gradually, and then all of a sudden.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think that is how social mobilization to combat climate change is going to move forward. We're going to see school strikes and young people protesting, and we see it today, obviously, with roadways being blocked. But it's gonna reach a tipping point when collectively people say we just can't live like this anymore. This can't go on.
I talked to an Indian expert yesterday also about the geopolitics of energy, and I asked him if young people in India felt the same, that like their security was falling apart and stuff, because that's kind of a mood that you experience in Germany. And then he said, and he was very correct in that, that in the global south, people would never or would rarely have this like feeling of security that people in Europe or the US have, that is now starting to feel not the same anymore. And then we talked about the changing geopolitics and like the feeling that we all have that some power systems are not the same anymore, and they're slowly starting to change, but we do not know what is at the end of this. How do you think the US is gonna evolve in this new power system?
I think it's a really important point, and we work a lot at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia to try to be a global center, to try to include perspectives from around the world, including the Global South, because the comment I made a moment ago that the urgency to combat climate change is going to proceed in a nonlinear way, I think that's true, but it's also important to remember how this issue is seen and received in parts of the world that are still developing, that still use just a fraction of the energy that we take for granted. That in some parts of the world don't have any energy access at all and are trying to move from 2- and 3-wheeled vehicles to 4-wheeled vehicles, to have air conditioning, to mechanize agriculture, the things that we just take for granted. And it's a huge amount of energy to do that. So energy security, energy access, energy affordability, clearly those issues come first of mind, as we saw they do in Europe when there was a crisis. They certainly do for people in parts of the world that struggle. And we should remember that crisis in Europe, prompted by Russia's cutting off the gas, that had ripple effects all around the world, right? Europe coped with that in part by pulling in a lot of the liquefied natural gas supplies from around the world. That caused the price of LNG to go through the roof. Yeah. And if you were in Pakistan or Bangladesh, countries got priced out of the market. They couldn't afford any energy at all, including coal in many cases. So I think that perspective is really important, and it's a reminder that what we're seeing today, I worry about, is an energy transition starting to unfold in ways that many in the global south perceive as hypocritical. Mm-hmm. And there's a growing sense of resentment at the way in which this energy transition is unfolding, where they're being asked to bear costs, and in their perspective, for a problem that they didn't create. They're responsible for a very small share of historic emissions. They don't necessarily have the financial resources to develop in a cleaner way. They don't have the financial resources to cope with the impacts of climate change, and the global south will face some of the worst impacts. Relatively northern countries will be less badly affected. And so I think that's something we really need to work together and take very seriously, because if we don't, it really does risk worsening some of these geopolitical fractures and fissures that we see playing out in the world already today.
Can you understand this feeling of hypocrisy?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is, again, what matters for climate change is cumulative emissions, right? The stock that has built up over time, not just the annual amount we are putting into the atmosphere. So while it's true that even a country like China is by far the largest emitter today, when you look at the cumulative stock of emissions, how much is accumulated over time, nearly half of that since the start of the Industrial Revolution is from the US and Europe, about 2 or 3% from the continent of Africa. So if you're in parts of the world that didn't cause this problem and use very little energy today, and then see the rest of the world, like the European Infrastructure Bank or others, saying, well, we're not going to finance a fossil fuel project in your part of the world because it's a fossil fuel project, and you say, well, but we need energy. So yeah, we can do more solar, but maybe we don't think we can do it all with solar, so maybe we get to have a little bit of a transition too. Mm-hmm. Or parts of the world that want to develop and actually produce oil and gas. And people are saying you shouldn't do that, but there's still record productions coming from other countries, Norway, the United States. So I think that sense of resentment is very understandable, and we haven't been able to make good, the wealthier countries in the world, on the financial commitments that we made, $100 billion a year in climate finance, and even that, and that's just a fraction of the roughly trillion that's needed in the emerging and developing economies by the end of this decade. In the United States, we had a historic measure, the Inflation Reduction Act, roughly $1 trillion. It's unclear exactly how much, but just an enormous amount of money to decarbonize the United States. And the question is, are we going to be able to find all the tools of international economics and foreign policy and development assistance to help make resources available to accelerate clean energy in the rest of the world? And that's something that's very difficult in our political system to get done today. So I completely understand it.
Looking at the time that we still have left, I want to share like a personal thought with you. I have like three significant points in my life that I looked at the US, and I remember very clearly looking at US politics and like feeling a certain way about it. The first one was in 2008. I think I was 8 back then. No. I was 12 back then, but I still vividly remember like looking at the television and stuff in the Obama campaign, and I remember the Yes We Can, like it was yesterday, and this feeling of progressiveness and like getting forward. And then the next point in life is when I was in Mexico in 2016 and Trump won the election, and everyone in Mexico was shattered. And this is a very crucial point. And the third one would be right now, looking at the US elections in 2024 and like thinking about what would happen if Trump won again, what would happen to the Ukraine, what would happen to the European Union, what would even happen to NATO and to the US itself. How do you feel about the upcoming election?
Well, I run an energy institute that's a nonpartisan organization. So, but obviously I worked for President Clinton, I worked for President Obama. So I share your sentiment and the sense of excitement that many of us had when roughly 1 million people came into the mall to celebrate the inauguration of President Obama. And again, Republicans and Democrats should be able to work together better than we do, but the Trump administration in particular was really worrisome for the U.S. role in the world, for U.S. leadership, for the commitment to multilateral cooperation. The comments we just heard the other day about what happens if NATO countries don't pay their own way, and what Putin could be allowed to do in response. I think the United States has been a very powerful actor in the world for leadership, global cooperation in many fora, including international climate negotiations. And it's important that our credibility remain high. And I think if we have these political swings where you work collaboratively in a multilateral way and then you pull out of agreements like the Iran agreement or the Paris climate agreement or something else, it becomes harder and harder. And you see that in Europe today, right? Just a few days ago, the editorial in the Financial Times saying it's time for Europe to look out for itself. We can't depend on the United States anymore. And that's hard to read as an American. And then, of course, there were many other things about the Trump administration I found problematic. My mother came to the United States as a refugee fleeing religious persecution in the Middle East. And I think that's one of America's strengths is immigration and the way in which we've been a refuge for people around the world. And that was, I think, very inconsistent with the approach that President Trump and his administration took to a lot of these issues. So that was a very personal issue for me, how much we are going to continue to be a refuge for people in need. Now, we have a serious problem at the southern border, and that's a complicated problem. But it has to be the case that we're a wealthy enough nation to try to think about what we can do to help people all around the world.
Yeah, that's a good way to end this conversation. Thank you, Mr. Bordoff, for coming here today, and thank you for tuning in into the YouTube studio.
Thank you.